We're learning new details about one of those deadly U.S. strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean. Sources tell CNN the U.S. military carried out a follow-up strike on September 2nd after becoming aware of survivors in the water. The sources tell us that prior to the strike, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had ordered the military to ensure everyone on board was killed. People briefed on the, quote, double tap strike say they're concerned that it could violate the law of armed conflict, which prohibits the execution of an enemy combatant who is taken out of the fight due to injury or surrender. Now, since September, as you're seeing on your screen here, the U.S. military has carried out at least 21 known strikes on suspected drug trafficking boats, killing at least 83 people.
Are you kidding me? We're now watching Fox News go full defense mode, trying to protect Trump and Pete Hegseth from what might be the most serious war crime scandal of this entire presidency. And I'm telling you right now, the mental gymnastics they're doing to spin this deadly boat strike is absolutely wild. We're talking about Fox News publishing op-eds claiming that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth didn't order the killing of survivors, even though we have multiple credible news outlets reporting that a second missile strike specifically targeted Venezuelan boat survivors who were clinging to wreckage after the first attack. Can you believe this? The conservative media machine is working overtime to convince people that war crime allegations are just politically motivated fabrications, while bipartisan senators are literally calling this a potential violation of international law. This is the kind of story that shows you exactly how the right-wing media bubble works when Trump's administration gets caught doing something that could land people in international criminal court. And here's what makes this even more explosive. Trump himself is trying to distance himself from the whole thing, telling reporters on Air Force One that he wouldn't have wanted the follow-up attack, and that Pete said he didn't order the death of those two men. Yeah, like the president is essentially throwing his own defense secretary under the bus while Fox News tries to defend both of them at the same time. The level of coordination and desperation we're seeing here reveals just how serious this scandal really is and how much damage it could do to Trump's entire foreign policy agenda. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Or Russia.
Yeah. This arena we've been talking a lot about Venezuela on a number of fronts. Obviously, there are these efforts that the administration says they're going after drug trafficking boats. There is the not so subtle pushes against Nicolas Maduro that President Trump has been leading. But the president also says that land action would now be part of the administration's effort to deter Venezuelan drug traffickers. I just wonder what you think about that threshold being crossed here.
It's a big threshold,
yeah.
Right? I mean, right now we're in international waters, but when you're talking about strikes in a sovereign country against,
So here's exactly what happened with this deadly boat strike on September 2nd. And the timeline is absolutely insane because it shows you how this whole thing unfolded and why Fox News is now scrambling to control the narrative before it destroys Trump's credibility on national security issues. The U.S. military conducted what experts are calling a double-tap strike against a Venezuelan drug boat, where the first missile destroyed the vessel and then a second missile specifically targeted survivors who were trying to stay alive in the water after their boat was blown apart. This isn't some minor military operation that went wrong. This is what international law experts define as a war crime because you're not allowed to attack people who are no longer combatants and are clearly defeated and defenseless in the water. But here's where Fox News comes in with their reality distortion field, publishing an op-ed on December 3rd titled "Why the Media's Hegseth Boat Strike Tale Fails Pentagon Reality Test," basically arguing that the whole war crimes narrative is made up by hostile media outlets who want to damage Trump's tough stance on drug trafficking. Come on, when you have the New York Times and Washington Post reporting conflicting details about who gave the orders, Fox News decides the problem isn't potential war crimes. The problem is that other news outlets are reporting on it and asking inconvenient questions about international law. The level of partisan spin here is absolutely staggering because they're trying to convince people that documented evidence of attacking survivors is somehow fake news or a media conspiracy designed to undermine Republican foreign policy rather than legitimate journalism investigating potential violations of the Geneva Conventions. And here's what makes this Fox News defense even more politically explosive and morally bankrupt. They're not just defending Pete Hegseth as an individual, they're essentially defending the idea that Trump's aggressive anti-drug tactics in the Caribbean are justified even when they cross into what international law considers war crimes territory that could result in prosecutions. The Fox op-ed claims that war crime allegations lack evidence, but we literally have Democratic Senator Mark Kelly saying on December 3rd that the second strike on survivors seems to constitute a war crime and that investigations are intensifying in both Congress and international legal forums. Yeah, like when a Democratic senator who's usually pretty measured on military issues and has actual experience with combat operations is calling something a potential war crime, that's not partisan politics. That's someone who understands international law looking at the facts and being horrified by what he sees happening under the American flag. But Fox News wants their viewers to believe that this is all just another witch hunt against Trump and his administration, rather than a serious legal and moral crisis that could damage America's credibility around the world and potentially lead to international prosecutions of American officials for violations of humanitarian law. The fact that they're willing to defend potential war crimes to protect Trump shows just how far the conservative media ecosystem has fallen from any pretense of caring about American values or international legal standards. But here's where Trump's own response reveals just how serious this scandal really is, despite Fox News trying to spin it as no big deal or partisan persecution that doesn't deserve serious attention. When reporters asked Trump about the boat strike on Air Force One on December 2nd, he said the first strike was very lethal and that Pete said he did not order the death of those two men who survived the initial explosion. Are you kidding me? The president is essentially admitting that two people were killed in a follow-up attack and that his defense secretary is denying responsibility for their deaths, which is exactly the kind of damage control response you'd expect from someone who knows his administration might have committed war crimes. This isn't the response of someone who thinks everything was handled properly according to international law and military ethics. This is damage control from someone who knows his administration crossed legal and moral lines and is now trying to minimize political fallout. And then you have Pete Hegseth himself saying on December 2nd that he did not personally see survivors and that this is called the fog of war after the second missile hit the wreckage where people were trying to survive. Come on, when your defense secretary is claiming he didn't see the people his forces were bombing, that's not a legitimate defense under international humanitarian law. That's an admission that proper procedures weren't followed to verify targets before engaging them with deadly force, which could constitute criminal negligence that rises to the level of war crimes. The timing of this Fox News defense operation also couldn't be more revealing about how conservative media prioritizes protecting Republican politicians over holding them accountable for serious legal and moral violations. This defense campaign comes right as this war crimes scandal is threatening to spiral completely out of control and damage Trump's entire foreign policy agenda in ways that could affect his political standing and Republican electoral prospects heading into 2026. We've got bipartisan investigations heating up in Congress, international law experts weighing in on potential Geneva Convention violations, and foreign allies questioning whether the United States is still committed to the international legal framework that we helped create after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of military conduct. This is exactly the kind of crisis that could define Trump's entire second term and destroy Republican credibility on national security issues for years to come, especially if it leads to international prosecutions or sanctions against American officials. But instead of acknowledging the seriousness of the situation and calling for accountability and reform to prevent similar incidents, Fox News is circling the wagons and trying to convince their audience that this is all just fake news and partisan attacks from liberal media outlets who hate America and want to undermine our military. The level of reality denial here is absolutely stunning and shows you exactly why Fox News viewers live in a completely different information universe than everyone else in the country who gets their news from multiple sources. What makes this even more concerning for American democracy and international relations is that this Fox News defense strategy reveals how Trump's media allies are willing to defend literally anything his administration does, even when it involves potential war crimes and violations of international law that could result in prosecutions and sanctions. When your go-to defense for bombing survivors clinging to wreckage is that the media is making it up and investigations are politically motivated rather than legally justified, you've basically abandoned any pretense of caring about legal or moral accountability that distinguishes democratic societies from authoritarian regimes. This isn't just partisan politics or normal media bias. This is a fundamental breakdown of the conservative movement's commitment to the rule of law and international norms that have kept the world relatively stable since World War II and prevented larger conflicts between major powers. And the fact that Fox News is leading this defense operation shows you exactly how the right-wing media ecosystem has become a propaganda machine that prioritizes protecting Trump over protecting American values, credibility, and legal standing in the international community that depends on shared commitment to humanitarian law. All right, so let me walk you through exactly why this Fox News defense operation is so much more dangerous and revealing than just another example of partisan media spin. Because when you dig into the details of what they're actually arguing and how it connects to broader patterns of right-wing reality denial, it becomes clear that we're witnessing something unprecedented in American political media that could have lasting consequences for democracy and international law. And honestly, the more you understand about the specific claims Fox News is making and how they contradict documented evidence from multiple credible sources, the more obvious it becomes that this isn't just about defending Pete Hegseth or Trump. This is about creating an alternate reality where American military forces can commit what experts consider war crimes without facing any accountability or criticism from conservative media outlets that prioritize political loyalty over factual accuracy and legal compliance. First off, let's break down exactly what Fox News is claiming in their December 3rd op-ed defending Hegseth, because the specific arguments they're making reveal just how far they're willing to go to protect Trump's administration from war crimes allegations that could result in international prosecutions. The Fox piece claims that Hegseth did not order the killing of survivors and that media reports conflict on who gave the orders, but war crime allegations lack evidence despite multiple credible outlets reporting on the second missile strike that specifically targeted people who were no longer combatants and posed no threat to American forces. But here's where this gets absolutely insane. They're essentially arguing that because there might be some confusion about the exact chain of command or paperwork trail, the entire war crimes narrative should be dismissed as media fabrication rather than investigated thoroughly by legal authorities. Come on, when you have documented evidence that a second missile was fired at people clinging to wreckage after their boat was destroyed, the question isn't whether someone gave an order or filled out the right forms. The question is whether attacking defeated survivors constitutes a war crime under international law that the United States has signed and ratified. And according to every expert in international humanitarian law who's commented on this case, bombing people who are clearly out of combat and pose no threat is exactly what the Geneva Conventions were designed to prevent, regardless of command structure or bureaucratic procedures. Fox News is basically arguing that war crimes don't count if there's any ambiguity about paperwork or chain of responsibility, which is like saying murder doesn't count if you can't prove who pulled the trigger in a mafia hit or organized crime operation. And here's what makes the Fox News defense even more legally and morally problematic for American democracy and international standing. They're not just disputing facts about what happened during the boat strike. They're attacking the entire concept of holding American military operations accountable to international law and humanitarian standards that we expect other countries to follow. The op-ed suggests that media coverage of the boat strike fails a Pentagon reality test, implying that civilian journalists and international law experts don't understand military operations well enough to criticize them or evaluate whether they violate legal and ethical standards. Yeah, like the only people qualified to determine whether bombing survivors constitutes a war crime are the same Pentagon officials who authorized the operation in the first place and have obvious incentives to avoid accountability. This kind of circular reasoning is exactly what authoritarian regimes use to justify war crimes and human rights violations. They claim that only they understand the complexities of military operations and that outside criticism is illegitimate by definition because it comes from people who weren't involved in the decision-making process. When Fox News adopts this same logic to defend potential American war crimes, they're essentially arguing that the United States should be exempt from the international legal standards that we demand other countries follow, and that we've used to prosecute war criminals from other nations throughout modern history. But here's where this gets even more disturbing when you look at how Fox News is framing the broader political context around this war crimes scandal and what it reveals about conservative media priorities. Instead of focusing on the legal and moral questions raised by bombing survivors who pose no threat to military forces, they're treating this as just another partisan attack on Trump's aggressive foreign policy agenda rather than a serious violation of international humanitarian law that could damage American credibility for decades. The December 3rd op-ed frames war crime allegations as politically motivated fabrications designed to undermine Trump's tough stance on drug trafficking and Venezuelan criminal organizations, as if being tough on crime justifies violating the Geneva Conventions and killing defenseless people. Are you kidding me? When you're arguing that war crimes investigations are just partisan politics rather than legitimate legal inquiries, You're basically saying that no American military operation can ever be criticized or held accountable, no matter how many international laws it violates or how many innocent people get killed. This kind of nationalist propaganda is exactly what you see in countries where military forces operate without legal constraints and commit atrocities while claiming they're defending national interests and fighting necessary wars against criminal organizations or terrorist groups. The fact that Fox News is promoting this kind of thinking shows how far American conservatism has drifted from any commitment to the rule of law or international norms that constrain military violence and protect civilian populations during armed conflicts. Now here's where Trump's own statements reveal just how weak the Fox News defense really is, because even the president himself isn't willing to fully embrace the narrative that everything was handled properly and legally during this boat strike operation. When Trump told reporters on Air Force One that he wouldn't have wanted the follow-up attack and that Pete said he didn't order the death of those two men, he was essentially admitting that something went wrong with the second missile strike and that there are serious questions about who authorized killing the survivors. If this was just a routine military operation that followed proper procedures and international legal guidelines, Trump wouldn't need to distance himself from it or emphasize that his defense secretary denies ordering specific killings that occurred during the operation. Come on, when the president is trying to create distance between himself and his own defense secretary over a military operation, that's not the behavior of someone who's confident about the legal and moral justifications for what happened. That's someone who knows this could blow up into a major scandal that damages his presidency and potentially leads to criminal liability. And Pete Hegseth's own defense that he did not personally see survivors and that this is called the fog of war is basically an admission that proper target verification procedures weren't followed before launching the second missile at people in the water. Yeah, like when your defense secretary is claiming ignorance about whether there were people in the water before bombing them, that's not a legitimate defense under international law. That's evidence of criminal negligence that could constitute a war crime because military commanders have a legal obligation to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants before using deadly force. The international implications of this Fox News defense strategy are also absolutely massive, because it signals to allies and adversaries that American conservative media will defend any military action taken by Republican administrations, regardless of legal or moral considerations that govern civilized warfare. When foreign leaders see Fox News arguing that war crime allegations are just partisan fabrications rather than legitimate legal concerns, that sends a message that a significant portion of American political opinion considers international law irrelevant when it constrains American military operations or holds our forces accountable for violations. This kind of messaging undermines decades of American efforts to promote international legal frameworks and humanitarian standards that prevent war crimes and protect civilian populations during armed conflicts around the world. Countries that have been criticized by the United States for human rights violations and war crimes can now point to Fox News coverage of this boat strike scandal as evidence of American hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to international law and humanitarian obligations. Yeah, like when your own media outlets are defending potential war crimes committed by American forces, you lose the moral authority to criticize other countries for similar violations of international humanitarian law or to lead international efforts to prevent atrocities and hold war criminals accountable. The domestic political implications are equally serious because this Fox News defense operation reveals how conservative media will prioritize protecting Republican politicians over holding them accountable for serious legal and moral violations that could undermine American democracy and international standing. When your primary news source is telling you that war crime allegations are just fake news and partisan attacks rather than legitimate concerns about legal and moral accountability, you're being programmed to dismiss criticism of American military operations that might violate international law and humanitarian standards. This kind of propaganda creates exactly the conditions that allow authoritarian leaders to commit serious crimes without facing accountability from their political base or allied media outlets that prioritize political loyalty over factual accuracy and legal compliance. And here's what makes this particularly dangerous for American democracy. When significant portions of the population are conditioned to dismiss war crimes investigations as partisan witch hunts, it becomes much easier for political leaders to escalate military violence and violate international norms without facing domestic political consequences from voters who have been trained to support anything their preferred politicians do, regardless of legal or moral considerations. The connection to Trump's broader Venezuela policy also shows how this war crimes scandal fits into a pattern of escalating aggression that prioritizes political messaging over legal compliance and strategic effectiveness in addressing regional challenges. The boat strike incident is part of Trump's aggressive anti-drug operations in the Caribbean that have included asylum freezes affecting 19 nations and military actions that go far beyond traditional law enforcement approaches and cross into military operations governed by international humanitarian law. Fox News coverage frames these operations as necessary responses to criminal organizations and regional instability. But international law experts argue that bombing survivors crosses fundamental legal and moral lines that distinguish civilized military operations from war crimes and atrocities. When conservative media outlets defend escalating military violence as necessary for national security, they're creating political cover for operations that damage American credibility and violate international legal standards that have prevented larger conflicts and atrocities since World War II. So let's break this down into the key points that everyone needs to understand, because this Fox News defense operation isn't just another example of partisan media spin, it's evidence of how conservative media outlets will defend potential war crimes to protect Republican politicians, even when it undermines American credibility and international legal standards. Point number one, and this is absolutely critical for understanding how dangerous this propaganda really is, Fox News is essentially arguing that war crime allegations against Pete Hegseth should be dismissed as politically motivated fabrications, even though we have documented evidence of a second missile strike that specifically targeted Venezuelan boat survivors who were no longer combatants. The December 3rd op-ed claims that Hegseth did not order the killing of survivors, and that media reports conflict on orders. But war crime allegations lack evidence despite multiple credible news outlets reporting on what international law experts consider a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. Come on! When you're bombing people who are clinging to wreckage after their boat has been destroyed, that's not legitimate military action. That's exactly what international humanitarian law defines as a war crime, because you're attacking people who are clearly out of combat and pose no threat to military forces. Fox News wants their viewers to believe that this is all just partisan politics rather than a serious legal and moral crisis that could result in international prosecution and damage American credibility for decades. And here's what makes their defense even more problematic. They're not just disputing specific facts about command structures or orders, they're attacking the entire concept of holding American military operations accountable to international legal standards that we demand other countries follow. Yeah, like when your defense of potential war crimes is that civilian journalists and international law experts don't understand military operations well enough to criticize them, you're basically arguing that American forces should be exempt from the legal frameworks that prevent atrocities and protect civilian populations during armed conflicts. This kind of nationalist propaganda undermines the international legal order that has prevented larger conflicts and war crimes since World War II. Point number two. And this is where you can see how Trump's own statements completely undermine the Fox News defense narrative. Even the president himself isn't willing to fully embrace the argument that everything was handled properly and legally during the boat strike operation. When Trump told reporters on Air Force One on December 2nd that he wouldn't have wanted the follow-up attack and that Pete said he didn't order the death of those two men, he was essentially admitting that something went wrong with the second missile strike that killed survivors. If this was just a routine military operation that followed proper procedures and international legal guidelines, Trump wouldn't need to distance himself from it or emphasize that his defense secretary denies responsibility for specific killings that occurred during the operation. And Pete Hegseth's own defense that he did not personally see survivors and that this is called the fog of war is basically an admission that proper target verification procedures weren't followed before launching the second missile at people in the water. Come on. When your defense secretary is claiming he didn't see the people his forces were bombing, that's not a legitimate military defense. That's evidence of criminal negligence that could constitute a war crime under international law that requires military forces to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants before engaging targets with deadly force. The fact that Fox News is trying to defend this level of operational negligence shows how far conservative media will go to protect Republican politicians from accountability for serious legal and moral violations. And here's what makes this particularly concerning for American foreign policy. When your own media outlets are defending potential war crimes and operational failures, it signals to allies and adversaries that significant portions of American political opinion consider international law irrelevant when it constrains Republican military operations. Point number three, and this is where the broader political implications become absolutely massive for American democracy and international relations. This Fox News defense strategy reveals how conservative media outlets will prioritize protecting Republican politicians over holding them accountable for serious violations of international law and military ethics. When your primary news source is telling you that war crime allegations are just fake news and partisan attacks rather than legitimate concerns about legal and moral accountability, You're being conditioned to dismiss criticism of American military operations that might violate international humanitarian standards. This kind of propaganda creates exactly the conditions that allow authoritarian leaders to commit serious crimes without facing accountability from their political base or allied media outlets that prioritize political loyalty over factual accuracy and legal compliance. And the international implications are really serious because foreign leaders are watching Fox News defend potential American war crimes and drawing conclusions about whether the United States is still committed to the international legal frameworks that we helped establish after World War II. Yeah, like when countries see American media outlets arguing that war crimes investigations are just partisan witch hunts, they lose confidence in American moral authority and become less willing to cooperate with U.S. military and diplomatic initiatives that depend on shared commitment to international law and human rights standards. The damage to American soft power and credibility from this kind of propaganda will be felt for years and could fundamentally change how other nations view our role in promoting democracy and rule of law around the world. And point number 4 is and this is the most important long-term issue that affects American democracy and international stability. This Fox News defense operation shows how right-wing media has become a propaganda machine that will defend literally any action taken by Republican administrations, even when it involves potential war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law. When conservative media outlets adopt the same authoritarian logic that dictatorships use to justify war crimes and avoid accountability, arguing that only military officials can evaluate military operations and that outside criticism is illegitimate by definition, they're undermining the democratic institutions and legal frameworks that are supposed to prevent American forces from operating without civilian oversight and international legal constraints. The fact that Fox News is promoting this kind of thinking to defend Pete Hegseth and Trump shows how far American conservatism has drifted from any commitment to the rule of law or international norms that constrain military violence and protect human rights. And here's what makes this particularly dangerous for the 2026 midterms and American politics generally, when significant portions of the population are programmed to dismiss war crimes investigations as partisan fabrications. It becomes much easier for political leaders to escalate military violence and violate international legal standards without facing domestic political consequences from voters who have been conditioned to support anything their preferred politicians do. Come on, when your media ecosystem is defending potential war crimes as necessary national security measures, you've created exactly the kind of propaganda environment that enables authoritarian behavior and undermines democratic accountability. Now here's what comes next. And this is where it gets really important for everyone watching American politics and international relations. The success or failure of this Fox News defense strategy will determine whether American conservative media can continue to provide political cover for potential war crimes, or whether there will be enough public pressure and congressional oversight to force real accountability for violations of international law. The stakes couldn't be higher because this scandal goes to the heart of whether America will continue to be seen as a country that respects international legal standards and human rights, or whether we're becoming an authoritarian power that commits war crimes while our media outlets defend them as necessary political measures. This Fox News defense operation isn't just about one boat strike, it's about whether American democracy can maintain the legal and moral frameworks that separate civilized nations from authoritarian regimes that operate without accountability.